Hi, all. I'm so excited to share this conversation with you. Today, we're diving into the story behind Jasmine, the JavaScript testing framework. Did you know that Jasmine didn't start as a web testing tool at all? It was originally created for testing mobile apps for the Palm Pre, a device that existed for a hot minute in 2010. In this conversation, Davis Frank, co-creator of Jasmine, and I sit down to talk about everything from how Jasmine came to be, to how it gained so much traction so quickly, to advice for future tool builders. You ready? Let's dig in. Hi, I'm Elisabeth Hendrickson, and today I'm talking with my good friend Davis Frank. Davis and I know each other from Pivotal way back in the day, starting with Pivotal Labs circa, I think it was 2010. Is that right, Davis?
It might have been 2009, but yeah.
Okay. So do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I mean, you've done a good job with it so far. Was at Pivotal Labs and Pivotal Software for basically 13 years, but have done in my, and that's my most recent sort of big and what people most big assignment and or job, and what most people know me from. But before that, I worked in games, and I worked, and we'll talk about this at Palm and Handspring. Done a bunch of different low-level graphics things, but yeah, we're here to talk about Jasmine, which is sort of this weird, or I should say, interesting little history of my career, where suddenly I was writing open source, which I didn't expect.
Well, and I want to go all the way back to the very beginning, the origins of Jasmine. So the way you and I ended up on the same project, it was the Palm Pre project.
Yes.
And people listening may not even know what a Palm Pre was because it was pretty short-lived.
Oh, sigh. Yes.
Yeah, early days of
Early
smartphones.
days.
And the Palm Pre had a completely custom operating system that was entirely written in JavaScript.
The UI layer was all in JavaScript, yes.
Okay. And the way I got involved with the project was basically my friends at Pivotal, who Chris Sepulveda, and had reached out to me, and he and Rob Me had been talking about testing being a challenge on this particular project, and they invited me to come in because they wanted some help with testing. And I remember thinking, I'm not sure how I will be able to help with testing because Pivotal already has some of the most test-obsessed developers I have ever had the good fortune to work with. But okay, let's see if I can help. And I got there, and sure enough, test automation was a huge challenge because this is a mobile device that has a custom front end. And although there's an emulator, it defies automation in many different ways. But
yes.
You had already been working on Jasmine. It was already in existence when I arrived. So I want to know the part that I don't know. Help me understand what made you start writing Jasmine.
Sure. So I want to go back a little further than when you showed up, and whatever that was, late 2009. I think it was mid 2009. I think you came before the pre-launch, and the pre-launched in June 9th, 06, 09, 09. Those of us that paid attention to that stuff. But let's go back a little bit further, almost a year in back fall of 08. And so I'd been at Pivotal Labs for a little bit at that time. I'd worked at a Pivotal Labs client. We were doing a lot of Rails, Ruby on Rails work, and this is in the 1.2, 1.3 timeframe. And we were definitely on a lot of our projects doing a lot of JavaScript heavy for the time. It would be lightweight by what most people are doing now, but we were doing a lot of heavy JS work on the front end with Rails apps in the back. And we were doing, as you of course know, and as maybe folks here know, a lot of TDD, as much as we could, pairing pretty much 95+% of the time, and using XP methodology pretty much by the book. And we were mostly using, for that JavaScript testing, JS Unit, which, and this will be key in a second, had its own server that would serve your JavaScript separately and test it independently of your Rails app. And that's what we were doing. I barely understood JS at the time. which is ironic. And there was another test framework that another pivot, I think it was Nick Callan was one of the writers, called Screw Unit, that was a little,
Screw unit.
which was more independent of this server component. I think actually Edward Hyatt was
Edward
one of
Hyatt wrote JS Unit.
wrote JS
because
Unit.
I totally remember when JS Unit became a thing, because before that you really couldn't. There was no good way to unit test your JavaScript,
Right.
and that required you to have a page where you had your DOM and like it yeah.
Right.
It required an awful lot of heavy lifting to get a very small amount of information.
Right. Exactly. And that's all super helpful because, right, a lot of the JS we were writing at this time were like on-click handlers and like event handlers that were actually being stored in DOM nodes, because it was like sort of in the early days of JS being including at the top of your web page and stuff like that. I think so. So that was where we were. Also in 2008 was when JS, the good parts came out, which helped me immensely because it made me start thinking of JavaScript as like an actual language, and not just something you glued to your DOM. That was super helpful. So I mentioned I had worked at Handspring and Palm, and they were in the process of, I don't think it even had the name of WebOS yet for the Palm Pre and the Pixie, which was the smaller phone that eventually came out in 2009. But I'd been at Palm and Handspring for about 5.5 years. And they were kind of taking the sort of moonshot approach with this new phone, and they were basing all of their, I said UI layer, but yeah, basically all the application layer in WebOS. And I think still, because WebOS is running on every LG television out there, all the application layer was in JavaScript. As the language, you were building DOM nodes for the UI. That whole layer was using WebKit for all of that. So what's interesting is that Palm, and I was originally somebody I used to work with, reached out to me, said, "Hey, yeah, you guys do consulting. You do a lot of this web dev stuff." Yes, we do. And we're having this very interesting challenge because they're trying to get all these Palm OS application developers, right? Palm OS had a really robust, almost shareware kind of application development community, and they wanted to get as many of those apps as possible forward onto this new platform, which is completely different. Like Palm OS, interestingly, somebody described it to me as basically like a set of C functions with some UI primitives that sat on top of a database layer. Like it was very, very intentionally, because of all sorts of reasons that you can read about elsewhere, really, really lightweight. So if you were in this world of C programming and having to organize your code and your data into 64K byte segments, and suddenly you're given HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, that's a quantum leap into a completely different paradigm. So they're having a heck of a time with that. So the pitch was, hey, some of these Palm OS application developers could become WebOS developers by being Pivotal Labs clients. Synergies, right? Like, it sounded like a really good idea. Sure, why not? Raja Nagaskar and I went down to a developer day in my old office down in Mountain View, and got the pitch of all this tech that I've just sort of glossed over really, really quickly. And we left with the SDK for Mac, and we were supposed to figure out how to write apps. And Raj and I on a pair on a couple of iMacs for several weeks, trying to figure out how can we test drive an app? How can we take Pivotal's process, Pivotal's knowledge of all this tech, with no Rails behind it, all in JS, plus the good parts, plus this SDK. Like, what can we do? And it took a little bit. It was really nice. We didn't have any cross-browser problems. Like, you didn't have jQuery or need jQuery to standardize, have standard interfaces. Like, you got the raw WebKit JS DOM interface, or even coding interface. And then this is before a lot of the stuff it's in the browser now. We didn't have really local storage or anything like that, but you had a lot of really good stuff, and you could write pretty simple code, pretty simple JavaScript to do what you wanted, which is suddenly like huge weights lifted off off of our head. But there were a couple of challenges. The first was JS unit. So because of the way, and you alluded to this a bit ago, because of the way their simulator really sort of had its own, like basically had a wall around it, and you couldn't get we basically couldn't do that overhead, as you mentioned, of like picking up DOM pieces and running with JS unit to run the code. You couldn't take that app package or even the pieces like of JavaScript. I mean, we could test drive things completely independent of the SDK, but to get to things like location services and notifications, all the things that were very operating system specific, there was no way to fake those simply outside of using JS unit. So after we failed at that, we'd been warned by a couple of people that I knew that no, that's not going to work. That's not going to work. But you know me, I can be stubborn. Rajan and I were pretty stubborn, and like we beat our heads against that for a couple of days, and then threw our hands up. And then we started playing with other JS testing libraries to figure out like what should we recommend and use. If we're going to be writing an app, what should we use? So we played a little bit with screw unit. There was one called JSpec, and there was another one called JSspec that used RSpec describe and it syntax and nested, which we liked a lot. And we knew we wanted to go kind of down that route. So we played with those for a few days. And we're starting to make some progress. We were putting things up on the screen, like we were able to launch an app and like interact with it a little bit. And we ran into an interesting problem with some of the API calls, which were inherently asynchronous. And so to make like a database call, again, this is all stuff now 15, 18, whatever it's been, years later, like you just expect, right? In the JS world, but we none of these test frameworks supported asynchronous calls. You couldn't make an async call and then continue your test after that returned. So we started trying to glom those on, like async support, onto screw unit and these other frameworks. And a really interesting thing happened, which was like, well, okay, let's set the WebOS SDK to the side. Let's go play with this test framework. Like, okay, new problem, and let's just focus on that for a little bit. And we spent a few days writing, just spiking on how would we do this? How would we want the syntax how would we glom this asynchronous syntax onto these other systems, these other frameworks? And we ran into pretty interesting problems. Now it's been about maybe 4 or 5 weeks of screwing around trying to figure this stuff out. We're getting very close to Thanksgiving 2008, and we noticed that none of these test frameworks had test suites. So we didn't know where to start. Like, how do we know that we can add something as different as asynchronicity to however they were running their tests and not break everything else? And we kept breaking these other frameworks with it because we didn't know their internals. We hadn't written them. They weren't super complicated, but they were complicated enough that we couldn't really do what we wanted. I remember having this discussion of, hey, we're trying to add asynchronicity to this test frame. Do you have any testing that we can do? Do you have any suggestions about how to? And I remember the feedback we got was, or the response we got was, why would a test framework have a test suite? Which was kind of surprising. And we're like, so I remember sort of towards the end of that week before Thanksgiving, and we're like, are we going to have to write our own? That seems really hard. Isn't that going to be hard? I don't know. And we kind of left for the week, and I had a house full of family, and even while I'm like making biscuits and chopping vegetables and stuff that week with my family in town, I can't give up on like how would I solve this problem. So I remember sneaking away and like sort of bootstrapping, like let's have one test, and how do we handle this, right? We knew we wanted this like RSpec BDD syntax. Okay, maybe we should, you're going to be eventually be running a suite of functions. Okay, well maybe we just want to write one function, and how do we deal with assertion passing and an assertion failing, and how would you write a matcher? Like, it turns out there are only about 4 or 5 problems that you have to solve, and if you solve them the simplest way possible, you can iterate your way towards something like way more robust.
Wait, so what are the 4 or 5 things that you have to solve if you're writing a test automation framework?
I'm kind of making this up on the fly, but I remember, you need to be able to run a test. You want to be able to have some kinds of assertions, and you want to be able to fail the whole suite if the function fails or if the matchers fail. And so it's like, okay, you want to run some functions, you want to write some matchers that throw exceptions if they don't return true, and like, how can you do that in kind of a clean way? And it turns out it was not that hard to get just like those 3 or 4, maybe 5 things for like one test function and like an assert true. Like, wow, that wasn't too hard. And then, okay, well, how do I have two functions, 2 tests that I run? And like, oh, what about if can I add assert false or assert, greater than or equal to, or something like that? Like, but if you just do those really, really simply, it turns out I found, wow, this is way easier than I realized. Now, it got way harder later, but as you
We'll
would
get
expect,
there.
we'll get there. But I remember being really excited that I was able to write one kind of a long test function that had 3 or 4 assertions in it, and I could cause them to fail here and there, and maybe even getting to a little more maybe one of the more complicated matchers. And I'm like, oh, wow. I got kind of that first 30% that I knew that Rajan and I, after Thanksgiving, could pick up and start running with pretty quickly. And I remember sending him an email, and then I'm like, well, now we got to have a name, right? A lot of Jasmine in the backyard, and JavaScript. There's kind of JS and Jasmine and minimal, whatever. It just felt like it made sense. Started with a J, had an S in it, and you could sort of, backronym your way into anything. So that's where the name came from. And then we kind of hit the ground running the following Monday, and added a bunch more functionality to it. And it felt like, hey, we've got a thing, we've got a test suite for it too. By the way, it was TDDing all this, and we were able to, with 2 of us going, in probably another week, we had a lot of key functionality that allowed us to like go back and like actually start writing an app, which was really cool. As far as like Jasmine being useful, it was like pretty useful before the end of Thanksgiving, before the end of November of 2008.
That's amazing. Let's review that timeline,
Sure.
because that went from, like, it sounds like maybe a couple months of trying to figure out what to do and going back and forth and being frustrated and beating your head against walls. And a week after Thanksgiving, you had something you could use. Is that right?
I think that's fair. Like a week of solid pairing with Rajan and me, just, wow, we got to add this. We got to add this. Like, how can we make this as much like our spec as we think we need in order to write an app? And we had something that we could actually start writing an app probably before the end of that week.
Nice.
So it was awesome. And then the next thing that happened was, if we go back to the business side of things, Pivotal suddenly had 5 customers, 5 clients who wanted us to write web OS applications for them. And so I think when you joined, we had a bullpen in the back of the office because nobody was supposed to see any of the UI. And we had sort of a mini labs within Pivotal Labs with 5 pairs, 10 of us, and 5 workstations doing this. We had a secondary stand-up. We're doing really fierce rotation among these 5 applications. We did a lot of, hey, I need to add this to Jasmine. Hey, I need to add that to Jasmine. And so we had 5 different apps doing 5 very different things, all using Jasmine with 5 sort of different personalities of code. So like that 3 or 4 months we were doing that was really exciting. And the Jasmine development was like vertical because everybody was doing work on it. Every workstation basically had 2 had 2 repos going. One was Jasmine. Hey, I'm adding this to Jasmine. I added that to Jasmine. Oh, hey, hey, has anybody run into this problem with this API? Okay, we can do that. And like a lot of back and forth. So it was really like high frequency on multiple projects. And we were just, I will unironically use the word sprinting towards like just a whole bunch of productivity, both on those 5 apps and on Jasmine together, which was great. And so, right, so the Palm launch was in June of 2009, as I mentioned. And I think we probably had to have everything in the store, probably mid-May was sort of like a cutoff as they were trying to get all their infrastructure behind the scenes going. So it's probably 4-ish months, I want to say, of the 10 of us just cranking, and a couple of people rotated in and out to get those apps up. And I think there were 12 apps in the App Store when it launched, when the Pre and the Pixie launched. And 4 of them were the apps of the 12 were the apps that we had worked on. One was a demo app actually for Palm that wound up on the phones in Sprint stores that demoed how things worked. So that one technically wasn't in the store, but it did launch at the time. So if there were actually 13 apps that shipped that weren't from Palm, 5 of them were from us, which was that was kind of cool.
So I'm curious, all of a sudden, Jasmine became the de facto standard for JavaScript testing. And there is a path that I don't know that went from it was used to launch 5 of the original 13 apps on this platform that happened to have a JavaScript based operating system, which again will never stop confusing me,
Right.
especially given the time in
Mhm.
history that was, to general web applications. So I'm curious, at Pivotal, was there a moment where people who were working on Rails apps, on just browser-based web applications, looked over at the bullpen of people working on Palm Pre and went, "Ooh, you have toys"?
It was a lot like that. So what I recall, and I think it was Jonathan Barnes, who was one of the people that rotated off of one of these WebOS projects back to a Rails app. I think Jonathan came back and said, I need Jasmine and I need it tomorrow. What do we need to do? And we're like, oh, okay, that's interesting. We're over here in WebOS land, but again, it's late 2008, early 2009. Like JavaScript is like we're still pre-Backbone. I think Backbone came a little bit later, but like JavaScript heavy apps were only increasing. I'm sure that just about every project in the office at that point had some JavaScript component going on. And I don't remember exactly how this happened, but I know that we wound up building a Jasmine gem, and I think we added something else for Rails. Somebody, maybe Glenn or Steve or JR will yell at me when they're listening to this and clarify this for us. But I remember that we did some sort of side work as after our Palm work sort of ramped down to make it more Rails compatible. And it wasn't very hard, but I do remember that, by the end of 2009, every Rails app that had any JS going at all in our Pivotal ecosystem of clients was using Jasmine.
Was Jasmine open source at this point? Or, I mean, like, I'm just curious how that would work with you're giving the whole code to the customer, which includes the tests, and the only thing the tests will run in is this thing.
Right.
At what point did it go open source?
Pretty quickly. I want to say before the end of 2009. I mean, Pivotal had open source pieces, parts that we had sort of thrown out there in the world over time. So I think we knew how to do it, and I think I just needed Chris and Rob's approval to make it open source. I had no idea what that meant, other than making sure the MIT license was in the repos, et cetera.
So then what happened? Because so far it's been spreading like wildfire inside of Pivotal. How did it escape the Pivotal walls? Because just because you put something out on GitHub, and make it open source doesn't mean anybody will care.
Sure. I remember. I remember I suddenly was giving a lot of talks, and I think the first one I gave outside the company, and
I
I
just love how you say that sort of almost passive voice, like how mysterious. I'm suddenly giving a lot of talks. I'm pretty sure there's a whole like you maybe you submitted a to the call for papers.
so uh, getting up on a stage and talking to people was not something I had done a lot of. And I'm way more comfortable with it as a result of all this Jasmine work. I think the first talk I gave was, I now there's this big GitHub Universe conference every year, but the very first um, uh, conference that GitHub did was something called CodeConf, and it was at the Hyatt in San Francisco. I still have my T-shirt. And I think I managed to go on the day that they were giving shirts away, because I think we split a ticket or a couple of tickets amongst a group of us. And there was a lightning talk session. And I just went up and gave a talk about, gave a 10-minute talk about, hey, turns out you can test drive JavaScript. And went up there with, maybe 3 slides and a little bit of, describing its. And, I said, if you're familiar with RSpec, some of this will look very familiar, but look, you can assert things on the DOM, you can assert calls, you can Jasmine had spies, you can spy on calls outside of your code, etc. And that was the first one. I then got invited to speak at SenchaCon, which was also in San Francisco. Sencha, which was, I think Sencha is what EXTJS became for a little bit. It gotten funded, and there was a lot of enterprise customers using it for like UI on routers and switches and things. And then I remember 3 or 4 other conferences that, like, over the course of 2009, 2010, 2011, I probably gave 3 or 4 talks a year, a lot of them local at meetups and things, but some of these bigger conferences where I was giving hey, here's this thing called Jasmine, here's how you use it, here's how to tame your JavaScript. If you're a TDD or et cetera, is kind of, how it came from.
So let's go back to those first 2 conferences because they
Mm-hmm.
sound like they provide a great compare and contrast.
Okay.
So the first one, you said that startup world, and would you say that for was the audience mostly YOLO programmers, or was it a fair number of people who bought into extreme programming, test-driven development, kind of already test infected?
I remember getting a lot of questions right after. At CodeConf. So I remember being up there, and so I'm sort of bookended by 2 other people talking about, hey, use code to make your life better, maybe with or without Rails. And I was not. I probably was the only one talking about testing in those lightning talks. Felt like I talked to just about everybody in that room, sort of on my way off of the podium, trying to go get a drink of water after, talking for that 10 minutes, because everybody was like, what? That's how you do this? What? You can do this? Oh, wow. It was less like we'd run into Pivotal of like, oh, JS unit was good, but hard. Now I can work faster in JS. It was a lot of people saying, I have to use JavaScript now primarily. I have no idea, and I hadn't really thought about testing it. So this is super interesting to me. So that was like sort of the mindset that I ran into a lot then, in that at that conference. It felt like we were filling a gap. It was my first real exposure to people clamoring for testing that weren't on a Pivotal project.
So then the second conference you went to, it sounds like a very different audience.
Yes.
What was the reception there?
It was more muted, and which was weird, because it was maybe, it was within a month or 2 of that. I can go back, I'm sure, and find the dates. Google will tell me when it was, but it felt like it was fairly soon after. And I had a small session. There were a few people there that were really enthusiastic, but in sitting at, like, lunch tables and hallway track kinds of situations, there weren't as many people talking about testing. They were very excited on being able to move away from having to write UI in like embedded C or maybe embedded C++ or something, and wow, JavaScript is so freeing, and just throwing stuff around on the DOM is so cool. And this, these were all people that had been playing with this JavaScript framework or wanted to be learning about Sencha / EXTJS in order to do things, but they were not as much test first people. So I don't think it resonated. I had a couple of, 3 or 4 really good conversations with people. So I found people that were excited about Jasmine, which was great. But the enthusiasm, I think, was more muted there. It wasn't until some of the other conferences and talks I gave where there was a lot of nodding, and people would grab me on the way off the podium to ask very esoteric testing questions. That came more in 2012 to 2013.
If you think about Jasmine's history and its rise and eventual decline, it still exists, but it's not necessarily the de facto standard anymore. Beginning was 2009 to how many more years?
I want to say it probably started to dip 2015 or 16 or 17, because it sort of, the rise of JavaScript is happening. A lot of people are doing Backbone stuff and Backbone and jQuery and what else. But then React shows up as this 500-pound gorilla, and React development, has been huge in the last 10 years. It was Pivot Glenn Janke who had some friends at Facebook, and I think React had been around a little bit, or it was in its really early stages. And Glenn brought me an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper that was tacked up on a board somewhere on the Facebook campus. That was Jasmine 101, about how to get Jasmine into your Facebook project. And I still have that in a folder somewhere, because there was no way I was not going to hold on to that, because that was really cool. So that meant that there was somebody at Facebook, as Facebook is very, very heavily JavaScript, advocating for JavaScript testing using Jasmine on Facebook code. I thought that was great. That was really, that made me, I was beaming when that happened. Soon after that time frame was when Jest showed up. And Jest, interestingly, started, and this is a little bit reductive, but started as, it included Jasmine completely. So it used Jasmine as its test runner. And the difference was they set up everything in a world, and this is not something that I like to do so I was sort of anti this, but Jest took a mock the world philosophy and loaded everything up in modules and things, so that if you called out of your code, there was auto mocking, auto spies and things that prevented you from touching the rest of the world, which is fine for some level of testing, but that breaks down over time. So there was definitely more people picking up Jest, getting Jasmine through Jest, and we resisted heavily. I don't remember whether there were actual pull requests. Glenn or Steve may remember, or JR again may remember this, but I don't know if there were explicit pull requests to try to get some of that mocking in. But there was definitely clamoring for it, and we pushed back hard. It's like, that's independent of what Jasmine needs to do. That feels like we're getting too much up the stack. If you want to do that, great. Here's some arguments against it. And eventually, depending on how you frame it, Jest had its own system, its own test runner and thing that was very Jasmine-like, and Jasmine was no longer included when Jest shipped. So I still kind of see that as a victory, because, hey, if people are writing tests, I'm happy. If Jasmine got us over the hump and the industry wants to move in a certain direction with whatever frameworks and testing philosophies, good on you. You'd rather have tests than no tests. As everybody started writing React apps, and that means they're getting Jest sort of in the box, was when the download started to slow, because you didn't need to add it for your React app. It was just already there. And then at some point, it no longer included Jasmine and had their own thing. So I think that's when it sort of waned. There's still plenty of apps out there using it. I know Steve is still making releases. It's up to like Jasmine 5 point something.
Where I was going with the question about the duration of time. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, we're talking about, call it 7-ish years,
Mm-hmm.
where or maybe 6, where it was the de facto standard, which is actually in tool years. That's amazing because they're like dog years, right? Like
Felt
six
that way.
years of that is a well loved tool. What do you attribute the success to? Why did it keep spreading?
Why did it keep spreading? Um, so I think first was Rails. Rails was accelerating during that time. So I think definitely that was part of it. Um, uh, because Rails testing in the out of the box, right? This is among the reasons that we like Rails still. Testing is super easy to configure. It's very easy to use those muscles. Our aim with Jasmine was to make it doesn't matter whether you're writing Ruby or JavaScript. You're going to have to write both. You should have the same ease of testing. I remember one thing that I think uh, I always attribute this to. So I went to and gave a intro Jasmine talk at Fluent, I think in 2012. Again, well attended, great questions from people and whatnot. And there was this is very cool. There was a speaker dinner the night before. That happens a lot. But before the speaker dinner, to get the dinner, you had to go to the speaker unconference, which was a day where we did an unconf with whatever it was, the 30 or 40 of us who were speaking. And it was my first unconference. But the thing that I came out of that was because somebody wanted to talk about documentation, was a guy by the name, I think it was at Twitter at the time, but Michael Jackson, made a pitch for executable docs. I'm like, oh, that's kind of interesting. And again, one of these ideas I couldn't get out of my head. So if you actually go to jasmine.github.io today, there's a tutorial that is actually, we've got text going down one side and code going down the other. And the code on that page is actually running. So if any of the instructions in the tutorial have code going on the right-hand side, if that code doesn't work because of a bug in Jasmine, that page will be red. And this was all Michael's whole thing. I'm like, wow, I could totally do that. And we made some other cool things in that time, but we got a lot of traffic to that page. I wish I remembered the numbers. I don't. But that idea of saying, look, this is how easy this is to use. Here's English description about what this test code you're looking at. And oh, by the way, you're soaking in it. Like, that was great because that always meant that if you broke the tutorial, you didn't ship. We wouldn't push. And so I think a combination like that made us feel really confident that we had good docs, and those docs really showed you how to write tests really simply, even the asynchronous stuff, which was hard. We felt really good about that. I think that attributed to showing people like this is how easy this is to test, and I think that made it probably lowered the barrier to entry to a lot of people as well. So I think those are the couple of things that really contributed. A couple other things happened sort of in parallel to this, right? Node.js happens, and Mocha, which was how a lot of people did testing in Node apps, was happening in parallel. So I think Mocha sort of overtook. I think Jest was sort of eating from one side of the donut, and Mocha was kind of coming from the other. But again, hey, as long as people are writing tests, and Jasmine works inside of Node. There's a Jasmine NPM. You can write Jasmine tests in Node, but I think the Mocha folks were really into pluggable matchers. And that was something, again, that was complexity we didn't want to put in. We'd rather add matchers than add essentially a whole other syntax. And so that was something we pushed back against for a long time. The model I have it in my head is like, we sprinted ahead with Jasmine. We pulled a lot of momentum. And we're like, okay, I like Jasmine, but I like other things better. And so these other things fit in our environments better. So these other test frameworks came along. And if they wound up, overtaking, that's fine. They were able to get more attention on them than we were probably able to apply to Jasmine. We were smaller. Never really, it was not part of, it's hard to make money on an open source project. So it has to be a labor of love, or it has to be driving something like originally it was driving those 5 projects at labs. So yeah, I think that's how I kind of felt like it. It's like we created gravity, and other projects sort of came along and solved the problems differently for the market, but enough that Jasmine wasn't as important anymore.
So, to kind of wrap us up, I'm curious about any words of advice that you have for folks who are making tools now. Somewhere, somebody is, as we speak, writing a new tool.
Yep.
What, based on all of your experience, what would you want them to know?
Uh, don't make the problem bigger than it is.
Say more.
We all, as problem solvers, tool builders, software engineers, we all want to solve a big problem and solve it really, really well. And if there's anything that history has taught us, is actually just start solving the problem and pick a small enough one so that you can solve the next problem and the next problem. Right? It's the people with writer's block say the same thing. Just start typing, right? When you're in a facilitated workshop and somebody says, write stuff on Post-its, maybe just start listing colors until your brain gets engaged and you can actually think about, the question that's in front of you. Like, Janice Fraser tells us to do that all the time, which is great. So I think for me, remembering that, okay, you don't have to write a test framework. What you need to do is write a test function, right? That's how I started with Jasmine, which was, there was this really daunting thing. I don't know how to write a test framework. But just like TDD, it's like, okay, what do I want to do? Write a test function, write an assertion. Oh, okay. Am I getting the test results I don't want? Yes. Okay. Is it easy to work with? All right, let's refactor a little bit. Just making all those little iterative baby steps. Doesn't matter what it is, but I'm proof to say that I had no idea how to write a test framework until I ran into test frameworks that didn't have a test suite, so I didn't know how they worked. So I wrote one with a test suite, and we built it into something that was cool and helpful to a lot of people for those 6, 7, 8 years or whatever, and remains helpful today to some people 15, 16 years later. So I think that's cool. So just start.
Thank you so much. I am so grateful to you for giving me sort of, well, the inside baseball on Jasmine. Um, Anything else?
No, write code, solve problems.
Okay, that's staying in.